Welcome, this is Elena with Black Sheep 303 Creative, and the project I'm sharing today is a bit of an experiment for me. It is a snowy hillside I created using the Art Impressions Watercolor Trees stamp set and a bit of a variation on their watercolor method. Now to start off with, I spattered this piece of 140 pound Arches cold pressed watercolor paper with masking fluid using that spatter brush to create what will eventually be kind of a cool night sky or stars in the night sky. And I'm going to start off using this moon mask from Clarity Stamp, but I will wind up changing that out later because turns out it doesn't stick so well on the watercolor paper. But as I mentioned, this was all a bit of an experiment. So I have this mask that I cut just from some random typing paper, and these are the 3 trees I'm using from the Watercolor Trees set from Art Impressions. And I'm going to be stamping these first trees in pigment ink. Now this is Night of Navy, very old and retired Stampin' Up! Pigment ink. So it's no longer available, but I will link to a pigment ink, like a navy pigment ink, that is available if you want to try this method yourself. Now you can see as I'm stamping this, it's not going so well. It is kind of causing this weird line on the sides of those trees, and I do get a little bit concerned about that, so I wind up wiping off the edges of the stamp every time I stamp it. But as it turns out, the pigment ink really is more of like a placeholder for these trees. You don't really see these stamped images per se in the end, because I do wind up kind of adding more detail in later. So that probably really wasn't necessary, but little did I know at the time. I was giving this a shot. This is a technique I've seen Heather Telford do on her videos, and she's an amazing watercolorist, especially with the night scenes. So I was giving this a shot. And there I'm trying to stick that Clarity Stamp mask back on, but it's not really wanting to stick. And now I'm going to stamp what I'm going to call the maple tree, also in pigment ink, because that's going to overlap the night sky that I'm going to create here in a minute. And then I'm just using the other side of my mask to cover up the bottom of that tree just a little bit. So to start watercoloring, I am using Marvy markers, and that first one I put down was Prussian blue, and this one is African violet, and then this light blue is going to be steel blue. I actually don't wind up using the steel blue in the night sky, but I will use it later. So I'm wetting the paper now with just clear water off to the side. You can't see it, but there is some clear water in a cup. And now I'm going to water down this Prussian blue, and I'm just going to start slapping it on there. There's really no technique that I'm using. I'm not trying to be super fancy or anything. I am not a professional watercolor artist by any stretch. So this is just my technique for creating a night sky. And so now I'm just going to add in some African violet to darken it down, because obviously it doesn't look very dark. And you can see as I'm doing this that the pigment ink does sort of smear a little bit, like it kind of mixes in with the color, and that's fine because it works well with the night sky color, and it kind of really lightens up those trees that I stamped, as you can see here. So that's why later I will go back and do something to add those back in. So that kind of tells you that that pigment ink stamping wasn't as crucial. At least the perfection of it was not that important in the beginning. So really that's kind of more of just a placeholder stamping that you don't really have to worry about if you try this technique. Now I'm adding a hill into the front, and I'm adding the snowy pine tree, and I'm coloring this with steel blue Marvy marker. And that might seem weird because it's a pine tree, but you use steel blue for the snow portion of it. So since this tree has snow drawn onto it, you don't want the snow to be green. So stamping it in blue allows you to keep that snow looking like snow. And then later I will add in some green into the areas where the branches are to make the pine look appropriately green. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, and here's the skinny pine that I stamped in the beginning in the background. And I'm coloring this with pine green Marvy marker, and I'm just using my mask to kind of stamp it around the snowy pine, and then alongside the snowy pine behind this front hillside as well. And that basically is all of the stamping for this. And now I'm just taking a little bit of steel blue, and it's mostly water on my brush, And I am just kind of drawing in that hillside. And then if you go around that steel blue on the stamping as well as that pigment ink on that maple tree, that sort of pulls out the blue color from that stamp and from the pigment ink. And so that's coloring the hillside. And I do want to shade that in a little bit. Since it is a night scene, we're not going to have white snow per se. So I'm adding a little bit of shading with that ink that's already there. And here's how I'm adding in the detailing on those trees in the background. Now I'm just taking the fine point on my pine green Marvy marker, and I'm just scribbling in those trees again, and I'm going over very loosely the stamped image. It's not really well defined, and that's not a problem. I'm just being really scribbly and really loose and not worrying about it too much. And now I'm doing the exact same thing for the maple trees. So I'm using the olive brown marker here, which, as it turned out, was a bit of a mistake. I did not like that color. Once I added water to it, it was too greeny brown. It would have been better if I had done this with the Prussian blue, probably in the beginning. But it works out in the end. And so here's how I'm fixing the blue on the trees, on the snowy trees. I'm just scribbling in the little pine, like where the areas on the snowy tree where the pine branches show, with the pine green marker. And that is, actually it's the olive green marker, sorry. And that is really all there is to it. And then I'm just taking some clean water on my brush and I'm just dabbing it in the Art Impressions watercolor technique method. I am just basically dabbing it onto those areas that are either stamped for the like non-snowy tree or in those areas that I colored in with the pine needles. And now I'm just very, very lightly, with almost no water on my brush, going over the lines in those in the maple trees that I drew back in, just to darken them down and kind of define them a little bit more. And that's where I really decided that I didn't like the color of that olive brown that I used. And here I'm combining some pine green and some olive green to give a little more definition to these pine trees that I stamped in the front. The stamping was a little bit too light. I think I didn't use enough ink on the stamp when I did it. So there isn't enough ink on the paper to be activated with the water. So that's why I'm taking water and like watering down that pine green with a little bit of the olive green and then just dabbing it onto those tree images, just very, randomly and haphazardly. And here I'm doing the exact same thing with the little pine needle areas on the snowy trees as well. And honestly, there is no fancy technique here. It's just dabbing some water and maybe a little bit of color from your palette onto those areas. And that is it. It's pretty easy. And here I'm just taking some clear water and I'm going over those scribbled areas where I, scribbled in the trees. But I kind of decided that initial tree there with the pine green was too green. And since these trees are further away from you, they're in the background, they're going to be darker and more of a silhouette. You're not going to see much detail on these. So that's why I start adding in the Prussian blue to the pine green to really, really darken them down and make them like kind of look further away and more of a silhouette. And you can see like I actually almost wind up going almost entirely over to Prussian blue. And now I'm just adding in a little bit of very watered down shading to the hillside, and here I am fixing the color of those oak trees, or maple trees, sorry, by combining some Prussian blue and some African violet and going over those lines again. And here I'm just softening down some of the branches a little bit and adding in a little bit of blue to darken up those little pines in the front just a tiny bit, and just add in a little bit more detail to those front trees. And here you can see I have now drawn in, again, very scribbly with the fine point on my steel blue pen, the shadows that would be cast by the trees because the moon is behind them. And now I'm just going to take some clear water on my brush and just soften up those lines by going over them with clear water. And that is all there is to it. It's just water and just going over it and over and over it to soften out the lines. Do the lines completely go away? No, but that's okay. It's handmade. It's a little bit of an artsy effect, I guess, that I'm gonna, and it works for me. So again, here, just softening them up. That's all it is. There is to it. Nothing more important than that. And I hope you can't hear that very loud plane that is flying over my house right now. Sorry about that. Anyway, so I do soften up the edges of these shadows a little bit with some just plain water, just by like sort of wetting the area right around it to let the edges soften out just a slight bit. And I do kind of deepen up some of the shadows around the trees in the front, and that is about it. And for the final step, I am taking oyster gray and adding water and then just dabbing it onto the moon. Since the moon isn't just a big round flat ball, I wanted to add a little bit of texture in with the gray. So that's what I'm doing here. And again, no fancy technique whatsoever. So now you can see it's totally dry, and I have cleaned off all of the masking fluid just by rubbing it with my hands basically, and it created those really nice tiny little stars in the night sky. So now I'm going to add a little snow to my trees. So to do that, I'm going to use embossing powder and my Versa marker, which is basically Versamark ink, which is a clear sticky ink, but it's in marker form. So I'm going to use the marker, the fine point on the marker, to draw in where I think snow would be on these trees way in the background. Actually, I'm going to do it on all the trees. And I'm just very randomly drawing like little lines and little dots along the branches of these trees. And then I'm going to take that sort of sparkly white embossing powder that's up there on the left and stick that on top of where I have drawn those lines, and it will stick to those lines. And then I will just heat set it, and we'll have a little bit of snowy or shimmery snow, I guess we'll say, on the branches of all the trees. And I do that on literally all the trees. And on the maple tree, I go along sort of the edges of the branches and in the little V's, kind of places where you would normally see snow collecting after a snowfall on that style of tree. Again, no fancy method here whatsoever. I'm just kind of randomly picking where snow should go and just drawing it in with my Versa marker. And I do add a little bit of this embossing powder along the edges of the snow that's actually drawn in onto those snowy pines as well, and along the pines in the front. So everybody gets a little bit of this glistening snow all over to really add that kind of wintry and sort of shimmery Christmas feel to this card. So to complete everything, I have an A2 sized black card base that I'm going to layer the scene on top of. I did think this base was a little bit bland when it was just plain, so I took my Lawn Fawn stitched border dies and I used the little piercing die. This is supposed to like tiny little pierced holes all the way in a line all along the edge, and I used it on all four edges just to add in the tiniest bit of detailing on that black. Then I added some DMC sort of shimmery, pearly, silvery thread and tied it in a knot on the front, and then I embossed that "'Tis the Season" greeting on that strip of black using that same snow, like glittery snow embossing powder that we used on the trees on the front. And I'm just going to stick all this down, and that's the inside of my card. And then since my ATG gun does not like watercolor paper at all, I used Be Creative tape to tape down the picture or painting, whatever we'll call it, to the front as well. Is this project perfect? No. But is any project perfect when it's handmade? No. I think it turned out really pretty nice, and I'm pretty happy with it. This was a complete experiment as far as like how to create a landscape using those Art Impressions tree stamps, and I'm pretty happy with the result. I think it came out pretty well, and there you can see some of the glisteniness on that embossing powder. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of an idea of how to use those tree stamps if you have them, and how to use them to watercolor up a really fun little scene. It wasn't tough to create those masks, and so hopefully you'll give it a shot. I really, really appreciate you watching. Thanks so much. You can find a complete supply list linked below in the video description, as well as on my blog, blacksheep303.com. I'm linking below to 2 additional videos that are similar. On the left is another Art Impressions watercolor Christmassy scene, and on the right is a snowy forest that I created using distress inks and a mask and using a somewhat similar technique. Thank you so much again. Happy holidays, and I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my channel.